In 2022, we celebrate 130 years of HBCU football. On December 27th, 1892, Livingstone and Biddle College, now known as Johnson C. Smith University, played in Salisbury, North Carolina, with Biddle winning 5-0. Over time, HBCU football has evolved. HBCU football's popularity continues to rise. Millions attend games each year and millions more watch on television. The HBCU bands provide some of the top entertainment in the country. Over that time, some of the best players to ever play in the National Football League played at HBCUs. Every Monday through Friday on the HBCU Football Daily Podcast, national radio and television host Donal Ware takes a look at what's happening in HBCU football and talks with coaches, players, administrators, and media about the 2022 season. Make sure you join the conversation on social media by using the hashtag HBCU130. Now, here's your host, Donal Ware.
You've got it locked to the HBCU Football Daily Podcast for today, Thursday, October 13th. I'm Donal Ware. We're midway through the HBCU football season. It's a good time to talk about my top five players to this point. And then, of course, the top five teams to this point in HBCU football have got a nice game tonight. North Carolina Central is hosting Morgan State. That game is going to be on ESPN2. It moved from ESPNU to ESPN2. It's a big MEAC showdown. If Morgan wants to be able to have any semblance of winning a MEAC championship, it's a must-win. Already down one game in the conference in terms of the loss column, the loss to Norfolk State last week. Meanwhile, for North Carolina Central, it is the Eagles' first MEAC game of the season. So let's look at, I'm going to give you my Power 5 rankings so far midway through the HBCU football season. At number 5, I have Benedict. Benedict is undefeated throughout the course of this season, playing some really good football. I mean, I think in of itself, being an undefeated football team really sort of lends to being one of the better teams in HBCU football. It handled its business against Fort Valley State. I think a lot of, if you looked at the HBCU poll, Fort Valley State, when these two teams met, was in the HBCU poll. And meanwhile, Benedict was not in that poll. So I think Benedict certainly had something to prove in that football game that people were not giving Benedict its proper respect. You look at the defense, has been really, really good. I mean, you shut out Lane 14-0. I know it was early in the season. It's a Lane team that beat Tennessee State. Only gave up 6 points to Savannah State. Only 13 to Fort Valley State. So it's a team that's getting it done on the defensive side of the football and doing a better than solid job on the offensive side of the football, and is undefeated so far this season. At number 4, I've got Albany State. I think when you look at Albany State, again, you talk about strong defenses. Albany State is as strong as they come. The only loss on the season, Albany State played up and lost to Florida A&M, but you're talking about an opening week win against Mississippi College, a shutout of Clark Atlanta. I mean, it's not the strongest schedule, but I think the Florida A&M game elevates the strength of schedule a bit. Plus, I mean, it's a 23-13 game. Albany State falls in that game. And I just think Albany State is playing some really, really good football right now. Now, Albany State and Benedict are going to meet in Albany on Saturday. And so listen, my Power 5, those are my 5 and 4 teams. So that promises to be an excellent football game. And number 3, I have Alcorn State. I think Alcorn State is playing well, has won 3 games, started the season 0-2, has won 3 games. I mean, took number 10 Stephen F. Austin to the wire, falling by 4 points. Then the next week, of course, played up in playing Tulane, but bounced back on the road, a nice win against McNeese State. I like that win. I thought that was a big win. Of course, beating Arkansas Pine Bluff and then beating Mississippi Valley State. I mean, not the strongest of schedules. But again, last 3 games have been strong games, and you're looking at an Arkansas Pine Bluff team that has handled its business. At number 2, I've got North Carolina Central. I know the last game out, North Carolina Central fell to Campbell decisively. Okay, it was 48-18. I know they have Virginia University of Lynchburg on their schedule, like a lot of teams do. But you talk about an opening week win in Charlotte, the Aggie Eagle Classic against North Carolina A&T, who's starting to kind of come around right now. You talk about a huge win over New Hampshire. I don't think we talked about that win as a whole. We talked about it here at Box to Row, but that was a really big win over New Hampshire, who at the time was number 25, and it propelled North Carolina Central to the number 25 position. There have only been 2 teams in the FCS so far this year poll that have been top 25, Jackson State, who's been continuous, and then North Carolina Central, who's been in the top 25. So that's why I have North Carolina Central at number 2. At number 1, of course, it's Jackson State. Jackson State has dominated its opponents for the most part this year. Yeah, close games against Tennessee State, a closer game this past weekend coming off a bye. But you talk about the big win over Florida A&M. That was a huge win by Jackson State over Florida A&M in a neutral site game. And Jackson State has just been clearly the number 1 team in all of HBCU football, one of the best teams in the country. And so for that reason, I've got Jackson State. Obviously, I mean, I think it should be pretty apparent that Jackson State should be number 1. Now, let me go to my top 5 players to this point. And I've got a tie at number 5. I got Fort Valley State running back Emmanuel Wilson, who has done really a tremendous job in terms of running the football. He leads the SIAC, in rushing at 123 yards per game. He's got 7 touchdowns on the season. I mean, I think he's done really a tremendous job, and he's been a really good running back for a couple of years. You're going back to his days at Johnson C. Smith, where he was really getting it done. Comes to Fort Valley State and has really been doing a good job, and is doing a good job so far this year. At tied with him at number 5, I have Bashal Tootin of North Carolina A&T. Now, you talk about a guy that has really been able to do well for North Carolina A&T, one of the bright spots. I mean, if you look at A&T's won his last 2 ball games, a lot of that, especially from the offensive side of the football, has been because of Tootin. You look at his first 2 weeks, he had 0 touchdowns. His first 3 weeks, he had 0 touchdowns. You look at the last 2 weeks, a total of 5 touchdowns. He can get it done out of the backfield, obviously running the football, but he also can get it done with his legs. And so that's one of the reasons that I have him as one of my top 5 players, certainly at the midway point. Now, I wanted to pull up some stats right here. I don't seem to be able to do that, but I'll tell you this, his last 3, I mean, you go back to North Dakota State, number 1 team in the country, had over 100 yards against North Dakota State. The next week comes back, has over 100 yards against Duke. The next week against South Carolina State, has over 100 yards against South Carolina State. And then the next week against Bryant, has over 100 yards rushing against Bryant. So you're talking about 4 straight weeks of 100 yards rushing. He's averaging 106 yards rushing per game. I'm able to get the stats, 6.4 yards per carry, 4 rushing touchdowns. He's also got a passing reception as well. At the number 4 spot, I've got Jada Byers of Virginia Union. Now, you talk about a young man that's getting it done. He's got over 1,000 yards already this season in 6 football games. He's got 13 rushing touchdowns. Virginia Union was not on my list, could have easily been on my list as one of the top 5 teams, not on my list. Not that they didn't deserve to be there. They're undefeated on the season. They had a big win, obviously, against Valdosta State. I think the rest of the schedule not as strong, which is why they're not in my top 5. But they'll, obviously, they got a big game this weekend against Bowie State on the road. But Jada Byers has gotten it done. Again, over 1,000 yards in just 6 games. He's got 13 rushing touchdowns on the season. He is the spark that makes that Virginia Union offense go. And number 3, I've got Jarvian Howard of Alcorn State. Now, you talk about running backs, and Fred McNair mentioned this young man in one of the press conferences. And what he said, was that he compared this young man in a way, he's not, but in a way to Earl Campbell. He said he's like Earl Campbell. So when you make that kind of comparison, that's a serious comparison. He leads the SWAC in rushing, 129.2 yards per game. He's got 8 touchdowns. He's a transfer kid, I believe, out of Syracuse. And he's gotten it done for Alcorn State, 646 yards in 5 games. So that's why I have Mr. Howard, Jarvian Howard at number 3. At number 2, I've got B.J. Davis. I don't need to look at the stats for B.J. Davis, although he makes a bunch of tackles. He's got multiple games in which he's has had double-digit tackles. Now, South Carolina State as a whole is not playing well. The defense is playing okay, but B.J. Davis is all over the field, and he's the next in line of a Shaquille Leonard or any of these guys that are in the National Football League right now for South Carolina State. He's going to be the next one that's going to go. And B.J. Davis is an absolute monster terror all over the field on every single play. He can play in coverage. Had 2 interceptions last week in South Carolina State's loss to Florida A&M. He's all over the field. He can play in coverage. He's just a phenomenal player. Number 1 by a long shot is Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback for Jackson State. Let's look at some numbers. I need to look at some numbers. He's completing 73% of his passes. Think about that. 73% of his passes. He's got one of the best, and that's 3rd in the country. He's got one of the best touchdown to interception ratios in the country. 17 touchdowns to just 2 interceptions in I believe it was 208. I'm going to get that number for you, but I believe it was 208 pass attempts, 2 interceptions. That is absolutely incredible. Yes, 208 pass attempts where he's completed 151 passes. He's averaging 345 passing yards per game, which is 3rd in the country. 1,726 yards passing, which is 4th in the country. It's no question about it. He's been everything to that Jackson State offense. Yeah, they do have a solid running game, but this kid, even better than he was last year. And he was really, really good on last year. So, of course, I have Shedeur Sanders as my number 1 player at the midway point. Your thoughts, hit me up via Twitter at Boxtorow, BOXTOROW. You can also hit me on my personal Twitter account, that is, at DWare1. Don't forget to tell a couple of friends about the HBCU Football Daily Podcast, where you can find us on our website at boxtorow.com. You can also find us on iHeartMedia.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also watch us on the Box to Row YouTube page. On tomorrow, going to preview the HBCU National Game of the Week. Don't be surprised if we have multiple games of the week because there are so many to choose from. Talk with you tomorrow.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the HBCU Football Daily Podcast. You can also listen to the podcast at boxtorow.com, iHeartMedia, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to get your HBCU football fix on Box to Row with Donal Ware each weekend on the radio station near you, and on SiriusXM on HBCU, Channel 142, and on ESPNU Radio on SiriusXM, Channel 84. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Box to Row for the latest in HBCU football, and don't forget to tell a friend.